The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, and Escape from New York. These are the holy trinity of John Carpenter-Kurt Russell collaborations and are generally seen as anything from best cult film of all time to the best horror movie of all time. The Thing would get a prequel movie, but that was only after years of being underappreciated, and it would take a reevaluation for that movie to come to life. Big Trouble wouldn't even get that, as the IP would die at the box office and stay dead to the creators. While all three would share some form of collection of video game tie-ins, comic books, toys, and board games, only Escape from New York would get the direct sequel treatment, and even that was 15 years later. While it's not usually held in the same regard as its oft-imitated predecessor, it's slowly gaining traction as a worthwhile follow-up and a certified black sheep. Its black sheep status is multifaceted. It's a black sheep in its own short 2-entry series, a black sheep in the catalog of forever good-haired Kurt Russell, and even a black sheep in Carpenter's own much-maligned 90s output. What might seem crazy is that Carpenter prefers this one. He claims, and I quote, "Escape from LA is better than the first movie. 10 times better."
Hello, Pliskin.
While I disagree with that assessment, I can see a director or creator thinking that way. It had a massive budget compared to the first one, $50 million versus $6 million, and he was able to put a lot more of what he wanted into it.
I'll give you a deal, $50,000. That's a real bargain.
From a passion perspective, it's the only sequel that Carpenter ever directed, and the only time Kurt Russell ever played the same character twice, in addition to being his only screenwriting credit.
Draw.
While I may not love this movie, I do like it and respect it a lot more. Looking further into that same quote, he goes into having a preference of Howard Hawks' westerns Rio Bravo or El Dorado, and he's not wrong. In essence, these are the same movies, and while Carpenter already made an homage to these two with his home invasion modern western Assault on Precinct 13, this was his chance, John Wayne pun intended, to make his own movie better. Whether he did that or not is subjective, but I do understand it. He even gets the trajectory of his own career, telling us to wait for this movie to be recognized as a classic, and better, just like The Thing is now seen.
Skip the commentary, Pliskin.
Snake. Call me Snake.
There is quite a lot here to like in attempt and execution, but let's get the obvious out of the way first. While it's a sequel in universe, it's also a spiritual remake. Snake Plissken is caught off-screen and thrust into a prison that is just one of the coastal states needing to be turned into the country's new spot to throw every rule breaker into the same place. It's a life sentence no matter what you do, with no parole, and you can self-terminate before going in. There's an incentive for Snake to complete his mission because not only will he be free, but they will remove the timed death sentence that has been put into him. He goes into the prison well armed and with a way to track his target while running into people that make incorrect assumptions about him, even eventually running into an old cohort that ditched him during an old job. He's eventually captured and put on trial of sorts before escaping to continue his journey. While Snake eventually gets out and accomplishes his mission to help avoid a world war, he gains the upper hand after being betrayed and potentially screws over the rest of the world. As vague as that is, I could be discussing either of these movies, couldn't I? Escape from LA does a lot right. It brings back Carpenter, Hill, and even Kurt Russell as writers, and by all accounts, Kurt came up with a ton of the characters and even the whole ending. I love that he had so much input in their projects together, and here, he's finally credited for that work. Snake is still Snake, too. While the situation he's put into is a little sillier and more over the top than before, it's still Snake doing Pliskin-like things. He sounds the same, is still just as nihilistic as ever, and shows what he's capable of.
Evidently, I don't need to know, so fuck you, I'm going to Hollywood.
When he's storming through not Duke of New York's vehicle cavalcade, he's a badass that takes out people, cars, and bikes alike. He still makes promises that he may or may not be able to keep, and I guarantee you he still doesn't give a fuck about your president or your war. Russell steps effortlessly into the role again, and is even wearing the original costume when we see him on screen for the first time.
Hello, Pliskin. Welcome to LA.
As silly as it is, you believe Snake is capable of sinking every one of those shots on the basketball court. As legendary as the character is, apparently Russell practiced during the entire shoot of the film and made every one of those shots in the scene. Now that's commitment. While the Carpenter regulars that we have come to know and love, like Tom Atkins, Charles Cyphers, and George Buck Flower, are absent, we get a new breed of them. Stacy Keach and Robert Carradine come back into the fold after working on Body Bags, and Pam Grier shows up in LA a bit before she battles ghosts on Mars. Peter Jason is the only link between the new and the old, but it's always good to hear his gruff voice show up in a Carpenter movie. The other actors in smaller parts are just as fun too, with Cliff Robertson, Peter Fonda, Steve Buscemi, and Bruce Campbell making memorable appearances that run the gamut from original characters to copies of New York counterparts. Campbell in particular, as the Surgeon General of Los Angeles, is perfect as the leader of the new version of the Crazies. This time it's a cult-like group who just wants to keep adding new skin and body parts to their deteriorating selves in an attempt at immortality. Apparently a fan of Evil Dead 2, the first thing Russell said to Campbell was, "Say workshed," as that ADR line is now infamous for how it sounds in any version of the movie you watch.
Workshed.
While the horror elements of LA are muted compared to New York, they're still there. The lawlessness, sudden death at any time for any character, hopelessness, and isolation all give the same vibe as the first film. I'd say if anything, the outside world is more terrifying with a theocratic US government kinda making the country not worth living in. In addition to the overall mood of the movie, there are certain scenes that stand out, like the bridge with all the abandoned cars, and the cityscape in the skyline background that just feels defeated and haunting. The endgame Sword of Damocles weapon that shuts down the power of any electronic signal is also absolutely terrifying, and kudos to Snake for plunging the whole world into darkness rather than letting any fanatical leader control the world. The Crazies are terrifying, but the cult looks the part with effects by Stan Winston. Some of that $50 million budget really went where you can see it, and while we lost Carpenter's stalwarts behind the scenes like Dean Cundy on the camera and Alan Howarth on score duties, the folks who picked up those jobs do great work. The movie is shot very well, and while I personally don't find the score half as good as the first movie, it fits the almost Western world that Snake is thrust into, and with his duster, gives him a man with no name energy that works in this movie. While the good is there, it's hard at times to get past the bad. I respect and understand that. The CGI is some of the absolute worst, and due to an agreement for noise ordinance, the guns all have digitally added flashes to the muzzles to show they're being fired. The $50 million budget should have led to better CGI, but with a few exceptions, this movie was made at a time where CGI was possibly at its worst. Mortal Kombat, Night of the Demons 2, and a handful of other movies just couldn't figure it out. While there were some exceptions to the rule, LA is not one of them. While the CGI is objectively bad, some of the things may just need a couple exceptions to be made in. The side characters aren't as iconic as Cabby, Brain, and certainly the Duke, but they stand a lot better on their own if you don't take into account the previous movie. Difficult to do, I understand, but not impossible, particularly generationally if this was the first movie you saw out of the two. I see a lot of people in our comments whenever we discuss New York or Carpenter as a whole, so I know there's a lot of love for this movie. Carpenter feels that sentiment, and while Escape is listed as an action thriller, it's much heavier on the thriller than the action. I can say that unequivocally, the action here is better than in New York. There's a discussion that Lance Tyler and me have in terms of the master of horror, and when does his output stop being good and when did he stop caring? I've gone back and forth on the former, with In the Mouth of Madness being the original line, and it's since moved to Village of the Damned. I think after the most recent viewing, I've now moved that line to the city of LA. For the Carpenter caring aspect of things, it's definitely here. Look up how the man talks about this movie. As disappointed as he is that his greatest hits take time to mature and be loved, he sees that about LA. He openly talks about how much heart and soul is put into it, and he's having fun. Fun is not something I attribute to Carpenter often, but you can see it here and feel it. He's able to make fun of the government, religion, cults, and human nature, and feel like he improved on a movie that is one of the few in his catalog that was seen as a classic as soon as it was released.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Watch it again with an open mind. You'll be rewarded with all the positives I mentioned earlier and little nuggets like Jamie Lee Curtis coming back for narration. Technically, both movies are credited to a Kathleen Blanchard, but there is no picture and those are her only 2 credits, so come on. And a mini Big Trouble in Little China reunion. The Scream Factory Blu-ray and 4K releases are a great way to watch and enjoy a film that flopped at the time, is mostly hated, and deserves a fresh look. There is no escape from this. LA is a fun time.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.